Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on all matters property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. And we're live every Sunday from 10 a.m. on YouTube, Facebook, and on our website, propertymatterstv.co.uk. And if you're watching on our website, don't forget you can hit that Google review button and give us a nice review. That would be most welcome. And you can leave your comments in the comments section if you're watching us on social media. Just do it below where you're watching us. And if you'd like to email, the address is hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. We're also live as a podcast every Monday, so if you fancy getting us as a podcast rather than a video pod, then all you need to do is to go on one of those sites that you see on the side of the screen there, and you can get Property Matters TV from there as well. And we're also live on Dilsey Radio as well every Monday. So looking forward to meeting our Dilsey listeners on there, and also our viewers today, of course, and with our property expert, it's Joe Joshi. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Paul. Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning to those listening and, of course, viewing. Always good to have you join us.
And what a week it's been. Finally, after 4 years, Mr. Gove gets his Renters Reform Bill into Parliament, but it's a bit short on detail, it has to be said. The government has introduced its much-anticipated Renters Reform Bill this week to Parliament, which includes plans to abolish, as we well know, Section 21 eviction notices and improve powers to evict antisocial tenants. According to the Department for Levelling Up, the reforms will benefit around 11 million tenants and protect around 2 million landlords. The bill will abolish Section 21 notices, which was a 2019 manifesto commitment, and will help renters challenge poor landlords. They'll also be able to, the landlords, recover properties more easily, it says, so they can sell or move in a close family member, or if tenants do not pay the rent, notice periods will be cut where tenants are irresponsible and breach the tenancy agreement or damage the property. Landlords will have more power to evict antisocial tenants as the list of disruptive, harmful activities will be widened. It will also include plans to reform the courts process so that evictions reaching the courts, more of the process will be digitised and therefore cutting delays. And there'll be a new ombudsman as well to provide quicker and cheaper resolutions to disputes, with a digital property portfolio to help landlords understand their obligations and help tenants to make better decisions when signing a new tenancy agreement. So all of that we kind of knew was happening or was rumoured to be happening. But there isn't a lot of detail there today, Joe, not least about how the courts will be reformed and how we will have this smooth, quick process for any litigation required.
Yes, interesting. Mr. Gove is obviously on a course for collision with this whole renters reform. And the lack of details is clear, Paul. But what you have to bear in mind is that whilst it's going to benefit 11 million renters, it is actually only benefiting 2 million private landlords. Now, the question really is that these reforms that are coming in and these suggestions are actually only adding to the number of landlords that are fleeing from the private rental sector, because there's just so much red tape now that is involved, so many taxations and so many reasons why they don't particularly want to be in there. And whilst Mr. Gove and his reform suggests that it makes things easy, it actually doesn't really make it easy, because what they have to now do going forward is have a documentation almost pretty much every step of the way, every discussion, every email and so forth, before they can actually take action to evict someone. And if there isn't sufficient evidence that the appropriate documentations have been put together, then it gets thrown out of court and it starts again until they do. And so I'm not quite sure how it's going to make it any easier away from the Section 21 notice that is already in existence. I've always been a firm believer that the Section 21 notice should have a Section 21A as opposed to just something. So some of these things that are being talked about can be amended and added, but fundamentally the Section 21 has been quite successful and safe for as long as it has existed. When you start to sort of widen the scope in the type of things and the reasons why people feel that they can or they can't be evicted from a property, and the reason for the court situation is that the courts get bogged down. So they're thinking that if everything is documented online, you should be able to find a resolution through an ombudsman, another body that they'll create, someone else that they'll pay to sit there, and the police theoretically removing it from the court system into the ombudsman system, so that someone else can actually make a decision in why somebody should stay or somebody should go. But from a landlord's point of view, this is going to be very tedious and long-winded. If you're not someone that is computer savvy or doesn't have the administration skills that may require, you need to find someone, you're going to have to pay someone to make sure that every report is written, every email is documented, every conversation is listed, so that when you do go and apply to the ombudsman or a court of some sort, you can have, there's a better. But if you don't do any of that, you'll simply get thrown out.
Yes, it's an interesting situation, is it? Because they haven't really given us a great deal of further detail from what they gave us back in 2019. Yes, they were going to take out Section 21 rather to get rid of those rogue, or to stop the power of those rogue landlords, the few that spoilt it for the many, I guess. And secondly, yes, they wanted to say that you would not be able to refuse pets, and you wouldn't be able to refuse people on benefits, that kind of thing. So all of those things were stated before. But there just doesn't seem to be any more detail about how that ombudsman system is going to work, when it's going to come in, how much money is going to be put in towards it. I mean, it just seems to be the same thing that they put out in 2019. And I just wonder, Joe, whether this is desperation panic to get all of the things that they promised when they came to power in, and also try and get popular things through quickly so that they might have a better chance at the next election. It all seems to be rather rushed at the end of the parliament.
But isn't that the case in most cases? They're running out of road, and running out of time. The elections are due sometime in 24, and of course they want to try and sort of put their manifesto up and say, look, we promised this and we've done that. But I think it's a half-cooked idea, half-baked at this moment in time. And obviously wishing and hoping and praying that it gets chucked out, it doesn't get accepted, because it hasn't got all the detail that is required. It's very woolly in its current state. As you rightly say, it was the same as when they set it out at the beginning. But I'm a firm believer that we're changing things for the sake of changing them, when something isn't actually really broke. Yes, there are some areas that could do with some tweaking, and I think that could be done by some sort of amendment to what is existing as 21 and make it 21A, especially with antisocial behaviour and things like that. But majority of the cases, most people are okay. I mean, he goes on about how many people live in damp and poor quality homes. In percentage, those are probably out of 100, maybe 2 or 3%. It's not a huge house, but I feel it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut situation that's going on.
Yes, and I'm sure that's very regionalised to certain city centres, isn't it, as well, let alone across the whole country as 2 or 3%. But that old adage, I mean, I think actually what people are wouldn't disagree with is the decent home standard, making sure that there's a right to expect a reasonable standard of the rented property. I think no one would dispute that. But what about the thing that you used to see in the adverts? Do you remember back in the days of the newspapers when flats were advertised, no children or pets? Now you can't refuse them, it seems.
Yeah, I think the reason why the no children or pet situation existed is about consideration for neighbours, especially in blocks of flats. You can have a dog yapping away, unnecessarily, and it can be quite annoying if you're living in a modern block, which is, not particularly soundproof very well. And equally, the same with children. And of course, everybody wants, to have a family and have the pets. It's just a case of where it can be. But yeah, it's interesting that is now not going to be considered as not allowed, as many other things, and especially with them. People with benefits and so forth are also equally in the same way, because that was another sort of thing where we don't want anybody who's on benefits coming in primarily, and that wasn't because of the persons that were taking the rentals on that, Paul. It was more about the system. The system was designed back in the days. The system was very good and very clear, and people were happy with that. And that was, if somebody was on a supportive benefit of some sort, the government or the local authority will pay that directly to the landlord. what happened was, in the wisdom of the government, somewhere along the line, they thought, you know what, we should give this money to the tenant so that they can learn how to manage their money. So the government would pay the tenant. The tenant will manage their money extremely well on smoke, cigarettes, booze, and other sundry items that may not actually result in food on the table, but other things would happen. And of course, they never had the money to pay the rent. Then you got to a stage where for 3 months they didn't pay. The landlord ends up taking them to court and so forth. And so they really never learned how to manage their money. They managed their other things. And that's when people started to say, you know what, we just don't want people with benefits on it because we don't get the money directly and we end up going to court and spending time. So there is both sides of the story here. And I think that Mr. Gove is only listening to one side of the story. And I'll say it again, it's probably because he hasn't been a landlord himself and doesn't experience that situation. But once you're a landlord, you will see how many things that you've got to deal with. And it's actually sometimes not as fun as you think you'd like it to be.
They say that the new property portal and the ombudsman will make it more difficult for criminal landlords to operate. And you can understand that obviously it's a kind of registration scheme by the back door, because if you want to be part of the property portal and the ombudsman scheme, then they're going to have to know who you are, and you're going to have to declare yourself as a landlord or the property as a rented property. But I suspect that the criminal fraternity will still find a way around the system even then, won't they?
Well, you know what they say, where there's a will, there's a way. Somebody will find that scenario. But the government wants to have data of all the people that do have property so that they can actually implement their taxation and other aspects of the business. But I'm not, as I said, I think it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and they're just using, again, the property. I mean, look, the private renting sector has had nothing but a bit of a bloodbath over the last 12 months, maybe even longer, with interest rates rising for buy-to-lets becoming difficult. And if the introduction of this situation comes in, this will only deter more people wanting to let. What the government has not taken on board is that it's the private rental sector that has been providing their housing needs, which they cannot provide themselves. And they're now trying to shoot, the messengers. They're shooting the people who actually are prepared to do that. And subsequently, those people will become homeless and the government will have to find another solution. Of course, they brought a barge in recently to house asylum seekers because they can't actually house them anywhere on the land. So they've been bringing in massive barges so that they could put them in those. I mean, that's the type of government schemes that come in or go and send them to Rwanda or anywhere else when they can actually deal with it in local. But actually deterring private landlords from actually joining the rental market is their own doing, I'm afraid.
Well, this is something that Sir Keir Starmer picked up on in his speech when he was talking about this on Wednesday of last week. He said that he wanted to back the builders, not the blockers. So he was basically saying, yes, we do need to have local targets for local housing. And he said that he was also going to allow local decision-making on building on green belt where it wouldn't affect the local beauty. And he gave an example of a car park that was in Essex, I believe, and actually it had been categorised as greenbelt land because it was attached to a field, but actually could have been unattached from the field and could have been built on the car park. So he gave examples like that where there's an anomaly and they could perhaps use that land more effectively. So he's going along with the back the builders and not the blockers, and clearly sees a weakness in the Tory story.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're a poet and you didn't know it. It's all coming out now.
Absolutely.
But I'm not often in agreement with Sir Keir Starmer. But the point is that the builders are being deterred. Building is being deterred. Greenbelt, I accept some of the policies there in the sense that it is things like that keeps the country the way it is, based on supply and demand and the green and all that sort of stuff. But yes, there are many other areas, many other pieces of land that either the government hold or people hold, and they don't do with it. I'm sure that if they actually start to target the lands and the pieces of property where people have had planning or could get planning or just sitting there waiting. They could target them and say, look, we can probably look for CP compulsory purchase order on that and build a housing if you actually don't do something about it. The problem with planning is that people want to get the maximum planning, but it's the councils that actually deter them from having it. So there's just no win-win at all. And this land is here, they're doing nothing. Developer wants the planning. Planners don't want to give the planning, and so subsequently it just sits there doing nothing. But there could be a situation where they could put a time frame on it and say, both parties, not just one, both parties, the government could put a time frame, and equally the owner could put a time frame on the government. Say, if you don't actually come back to us with a decent proposal, then you're the one that's actually stopping us building the required housing that you all want.
Seems he's taking a similar tack to the way that the Tories did at the beginning of the pandemic, where he's talking about building more of everything, not just properties to live in, not just residential, but building more wind farms, factories, and much more. So he's clearly wants to get the builders back to work.
Well, Keir Starmer is just using the old Tory tactic, which is when things go wrong, build, build, build. But I think they build enough, but what they've also forgotten is how much money they've spent in the process of the pandemic, and so someone's got to pay for it, and now we're paying for it. All of us are paying for it, but you could twist it. At the end of the day, there's only so much money in the purse. It just depends who's going to get some. It's about sitting there and going, well, actually, this person can have some more, but that one can't because we don't need that as much. So whether it's the Reds or the Blues, they're only going to proportion it depending on where their priorities lie. But in terms of the renters reform and so forth, I just think it's another nail in the coffin for the private rental sector.
I can see one situation, Joe, where this could be a problem, this Section 21. So, for example, look at all the landlords that are selling up at the moment. We found over 30% last week are actually leaving the private rented sector and taking properties out of the rental market, selling the properties. Now, under this Section 21 abolition, it looks like you wouldn't be able to do that because you can only get rid of the property if the tenant is either misbehaving or they're behind with the rent. So there's no way, as I can see, for it to stop, for you to get a tenant out because you just want to stop renting.
Yes, and that's why I said to you that earlier on, it's got to be documented. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. Each person that you have a problem with, you're going to have to document all of this, why. Why does this want to leave, what your conversation was, what the reasons are, and so forth, until you get to a certain point where you start to say, well, actually, yes, this is a problem case. The landlord definitely needs his property back, and the tenant's got to go. But that can be so long-winded that it becomes costly and laborious in the long term, and makes it difficult for the tenant to move out. Sorry, the landlord to get his property back, and the tenant to move out. Whereas under Section 21, as it is, it's a fair and square. If things don't work out or you want the property back for yourself, the landlord has to give 2 months' notice and the tenant has to give a month's notice, and off you go and move on in your life. But this, I think, is it's just a promise that they said they would do, so they're trying to do it. But I'm not sure that it's done with the right intentions.
Okay, well, I'll do a bit of talking now, and I'll mute your microphone so that you can go and do a little bit of coughing. Is that all right?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm I'm drinking water as along, so you don't need to mute. You can carry on.
All right, okay. Well, our second story is the Resolution Foundation that's warned that even though the Bank of England is near the end of the rate-rising cycle, the majority of the impact on borrowers is still to come. Think tank says that the Bank of England looks set to have almost finished the sharpest interest rate tightening cycle since the 1980s. Latest rise, of course, was last week when the rate went up to 4.5%. But the foundation warns that the switch from variable to longer fixed rate mortgages has delayed the impact on households. It's a very interesting point, which I don't think we've really discussed, Joe. It says 2/3 of the eventual 12 billion increase in annual mortgage costs is still to be passed on. So the growing popularity of fixed-rate mortgage deals, which have gone from accounting for just over 4 in every £10 lent pre-financial crisis to more than £9 in every 10 lent last year, means that the majority of the impact on mortgage borrowers is still to come. These households will see their mortgage costs rise when their fixed rate expires and they look for a new deal. That's horrendous. 9 in £10 hasn't been passed on of this rate rise. So in actual fact, in trying to control inflation by putting interest rates up, the Bank of England has really not done that, or at least not done it until all of these longer deals that we now have on fixed rate have gone. So we've got 12 billion still to hit. So potentially the prospect of people handing the keys back and trying to sell their property because they can't afford is a long way away.
Yes, it is. I mean, the fixed rates that were there are going to come to an end very soon, and they've not obviously allowed for that in their calculations in terms of the inflation rate that they're trying to bring down. I'm not quite sure that this cycle has come to an end either, though they think it's nearing an end. I think you'll find that there's still another half a point left in this cycle before they actually start to settle down. And maybe that will be the one which will include all of these other 12 million people that are still got mortgages to come to a rise. Yeah, I mean, look, it was a long, long time for the rates to be as low as it was. There's no question about that. They had the opportunity to whack them up. They've done that. I think the problem we have to a large extent is that it was done in conjunction with huge utility rises as well. And now if they had phased the two out, we may have stood a chance. But the problem is they brought it all in at the same time. So your gas and electric and your rates and fruit and veg and everything else that was going to be is all started to come up at a cost, including the mortgage rate. So yeah, it's not good news as far as I'm concerned at the moment for the property side, because borrowing has become extremely expensive. Having spoken to some lenders recently just to see where they are, first of all, they're not lending as much as they'd like to, and secondly, the lending criteria that they're now doing are so intense and so scrutinizing that not everybody is winning through the affordability sector to get a mortgage. So the rental market is the only property area that people can find a roof over. And guess what? The government's doing a damn good grand job in mucking up those private landlords who are, leaving in hordes out of that because of the taxation, because of the cost of borrowing, and of course other things like the EPCs and so forth that are all coming, and then the renters reform will probably not help.
Of course, everybody took a fixed rate at the end of last year because they thought in a couple of years' time probably mortgage rates will be back down again to something like what they used to be. But I think it's now generally accepted that that's not going to happen. In fact, they're saying in this particular piece of research that the mortgage rate will remain above 4% until the end of 2026 now. And as a result of that, of households have faced so far just a third of that eventual 12 billion rise. So between quarter 1 2023 and quarter 4 2024, total repayments are set to rise by 5.3 billion as 1.6 million households see their fixed rate deals expire and face an average increase in their annual mortgage bill of around £2,300 a year. So that's going to be pretty tough. And furthermore on that, repayments for the 18 to 34-year-olds, so those first-time buyers who are on traditionally lower incomes, that increase is 3.4% of their income. But of course, for older, more wealthy mortgagors, aged 55 and over, it's just 1.8% increase in their out of their income. So it's going to be particularly punitive on those first-time buyers. And any time when those deals fall now between the end of next year and the end of 2025, they're still going to be remortgaging over 4%.
Yeah, I mean, once they get to their line, which I believe is going to be probably around 5%, the chances of us seeing a rate decrease from that is pretty low, in my opinion. It will stay there maybe to 2026, and if I'm still around and we still do this and so forth, I'll be the first to say, we discussed it then and looked at 2026, we're still at 5%. Because, once it's up, the chances of them actually wanting to bring it down is very slim. But of course, it's good for the savers at the moment. Savers are getting the best results that they've had in the last God knows how many years. When they were at 0.1 or 0.25%, now they're at 4%, and now 4.5%, and so forth. It's getting a good return on their savings. So that's probably a big plus for the savers, but not good for the borrowers at all. And the borrowers that are borrowing on buy-to-let or on commercial are all borrowing at much, much higher rates than one can anticipate. I spoke to a colleague at Barclays Bank this week, and he just said that they're now at 7.5% before they even start talking, money. So it's 4.5% base plus another 2% on top. 3% on top, or 2%, 6.5% or 7.5% is what they're looking to lend out. So, imagine going to a bridger, you are now at 12%, 1% a month, where it could have been down to, 0.75, etc. It's now literally 1%, and maybe in some cases 1.5% a month. So if you're borrowing £100,000, you're paying 10.5 grand a month back.
Yeah, it's. I can see now why the lenders are being so difficult in the stress testing, because clearly, if you're going to be coming down off of a low start sort of fixed rate period, and then you're going to be coming in at north of 4%, then it's going to have to be, and the suggestion is on average that's going to be 2,300 a year more. You've kind of got to be able to prove that you can pay the future rates.
It's really a challenge. I mean, when I listen to some of the guys coming to look at renting properties or buying, I mean, as much as their affordability, and today I was out, during the week I was out looking at a potential tenant who wanted sort of just a small one-bedroom flat. And, even though the rent might be about 1,000, 1,200 quid, they were looking at another £500 to £600 on top for. So we're talking about nearly £2,000 a month for a couple. So if they're earning 25,000 each, one person's salary is just going to give payment towards putting a roof over their head. So it's a tough game.
Final story of the week, one which actually had on the back boiler, we just haven't had time to cover it really, was about commercial property. Occasionally we talk about commercial property, and we have been talking about the government setting targets for rental properties to reach EPC level C, so that we can get to some kind of net zero by 2050, I think that the target is. But now they're doing the same thing for commercial property. I thought it was worth just quickly covering this off. Government legislation that came into effect on the 1st of April this year could leave England's commercial property sector facing a risk of 1.4 billion in annual rent, according to new research. Commercial buildings that do not have an energy performance certificate of E or above are no longer able to be traded or leased under the new legislation, as the regulations are set to evolve over time, with the minimum EPC rating rising to C in 2027 and B in 2030, even higher than the residentials, interestingly. The level of regional rent at risk could increase to 3 billion and 4.8 billion respectively as the legislation tightens. What's really interesting here, Joe, is you think about all of the landlords struggling to rent properties in the high street, for example, and that's just going to be another nail in the high street's coffin, not least.
Yes, in the commercial sector, I think the biggest culprits are probably what we call the sheds, the warehouses and so forth, and they're very hard to control on their EPCs, because basically they are steel framed, corrugated, or some sort of, it's not going to be insulated or dealt with for EPCs targets. But yes, what the government is saying, that everything, and this is all about zero carbon ultimately, that's what their target is, which is a big challenge. But, if it means that they are going to bring these people into line with the commercial up to C in 2025, at the moment it's E minimum, but, it's going to be leaving a lot of properties empty, commercial properties empty, not just industrial, but like you say, in the high street as well. Hopefully the high street won't be as affected as much, because they can be insulated by the fact that they are neighbour and attached properties with other high street shops. But when you imagine that you've got a standalone unit in the middle of an industrial estate, and sort of no one to cuddle to, your EPC is going to be way up there, and trying to get that done is going to be a challenge. So yes, the sheds are probably going to be the biggest losers out of this. The shops will be, but I think it's just a case of you have to plan. And in commercial, they've got to start to plan now, because first of all, it's come into law, and secondly, 2027 is actually not that far away under the circumstances.
Yeah, analysis from EG, the provider of data, news and analytics for the commercial real estate sector, said that London's commercial real estate market will be hardest hit. 24.1 million square feet will fail to meet the regulations, and across the UK, that number rises to 95.6 million square feet. That's a lot of boarded up commercial property to look forward to, Joe.
Yeah, hopefully they won't get to that point. But yes, when you put it like that, it seems like a hell of a lot of boarding. But somebody will win, and all the boarding companies will win, because they've got to board them up. And hopefully they are EPC compliant, because otherwise they won't be able to operate either. So yeah, it's one for the books at the moment. But commercially, just like in the residential side, the government's having a good go in trying to get us to net zero in carbon.
And I guess that's, laudable to try and achieve that. It's a question of how you go about it, I guess. So we'll keep our eye on all of the stories that we've spoken about today, not least, of course, the Renters Reform Bill. And we'll be back same time next week with another Property Matters.